Hello and welcome to ILO Live on Facebook. We're here at the Palais des Nations in Geneva for the International Labour Conference for our sessions called Meet the Experts. And our experts today, on my left I have Tim Springett, who's with the UK Chamber of Shipping, and also on my left Mark Dickinson of Nautilus. Gentlemen, hello.
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 How are you?
Glad you could be with us today. We really appreciate it. Today, delegates from all over the world, including representatives of governments, workers and employers, meet to consider issues to do with the world of work. On the agenda today, this very day, the Maritime Labour Convention 2006. It's a very interesting agreement, the MLC. I think the word might be instrument, with lots of unique characteristics, and we're going to be talking about some of those today. But we've got a particular area of focus. We're going to talk about one of the proposed amendments to the MLC, and that's to do with a new guidance on harassment and bullying at sea. And with me, these gentlemen are in fact the architects of that agreement. But unusually, we've got today a representative of ship owners and a representative of unions with us. And before we get on to the actual substance of the conversation, let's talk a bit about your two organisations if we can. First, Mark, a brief history of Nautilus, if you will.
Okay, so we created or born in 1857, so you want me to compress that into a couple of seconds?
We can keep it to 2 minutes, yeah.
More recently, Nautilus International, the latest manifestation of that long history of organising maritime professionals in the shipping industry and fluvial industry, inland waterways as well. We were created through a merger between the British Union, Nautilus UK, formerly known as Newmast, Nautilus NL, formerly known as FWZ. I'm not going to pronounce that because my Dutch isn't good enough. And in 2011, Swiss maritime workers from UNIA joined us. So we are, our organising base is the UK, Netherlands and Switzerland.
So, if I hear you correctly, you're a union that transcends borders. This is pretty unusual, isn't it?
It is pretty unusual. We claim we're unique. One or two others might disagree, but I think we're there to be knocked off our perch.
And Tim, the UK Chamber of Shipping, how does that fit into the global shipping ecosystem?
Well, we've been in existence for around 140 years, and we're the trade association for companies based in the UK that either own or manage ships or have an interest in the prosperity of British shipping and therefore support our overall aims in seeking to deliver the optimum operating environment for British shipping. We're also key players in the International Chamber of Shipping, which is headquartered in London and which acts as the social partner in the ILO's maritime machinery on behalf of global ship owners.
Okay, so you're the umbrella organisation for British shipping and you look up to another organisation above you. If you've just joined us, you are on Facebook Live. This is the ILO on Facebook Live, and we today are learning about a new amendment to the Maritime Labour Convention with our guests. My name is Pete Forster. If you've got any questions, we're very interested to hear from you. You can put them to our experts. The way to do that is to go to Facebook, put your questions in the comments there, and we will get onto them as soon as we can as the conversation progresses. Now, it might seem odd to be speaking just to solely two UK-based organisations because it is by nature an international industry with international elements to the conversation. But we're looking at this particularly because of an initiative that you guys put together for the Maritime Labour Convention. It stemmed from the UK industry, and it's a pretty interesting example, I think, of what we call social dialogue. We might spend a few moments in a moment talking about what social dialogue means in this context, but you guys got together and made some pretty interesting changes or pretty interesting suggestions for the MLC. Let's talk a bit, before we get onto that, let's talk a bit about the Maritime Labour Convention itself. It's often described as the Maritime Bill of Rights for seafarers. Both of you have been around long enough, I believe, to understand what predated it. Mark, maybe you can describe the landscape on labour relations and norms before the MLC was introduced.
Okay, well, before the MLC was adopted, we had a body of instruments, conventions and recommendations adopted by the ILO dating back to the very beginnings of the ILO's existence. So in around the late 90s, I believe the ILO governing body was looking back at the plethora of instruments that have been adopted across all sectors and was recommending changes, promoting some, negating others, reviewing the body of instruments. And we had 69 instruments, conventions and recommendations covering seafarers. And what we did as social partners, ITF, the International Transport Workers Federation, and the International Chamber of Shipping and International Shipping Federation, ICS, ISF and ITF, was we identified that most of our conventions had been quite poorly ratified. I think they were quite influential across the piece, but they were quite poorly ratified. Some were out of date, having been adopted in the 1920s, and others, for example, minimum standards for merchant shipping, ILO Convention 147, really very significant and very important. What we decided to do in the end, having analysed those 69 instruments, was to consolidate them and update them into one convention that was capable of being amended so that it would never again fall behind the needs of the industry.
Sure, that's one of the features of the MLC 2006. It's got this inbuilt mechanism for review and updating.
That's right.
Tim, what do you remember of those conversations in the 90s about bringing this new instrument to life?
I remember there being a real determination, including among ship owners, to get this body of legislation covering international labour standards into force. There were pressures from elsewhere. For example, the ITF with their campaign against open registers, which they call the Flag of Convenience campaign. There was a big social action programme taking place in Europe, and a lot of moves towards adopting European laws to improve working conditions. And it was really against that background that we looked at ourselves and thought, if we want standards in the industry, we want to protect ourselves, because I firmly believe that ICS represents good ship owners around the world, then we need to have an effective floor for labour standards, and something that the whole world is going to observe. And we always favour global standards over regional ones, because we didn't want something that people could just avoid by not registering their ships under a flag that was a ratifying member for these conventions. So the MLC was our way of going through a process of examining the old instruments, bringing them up to date, ditching the ones that were no longer relevant, and getting an instrument with proper teeth, proper enforcement mechanisms, and, as Mark has quite rightly said, a procedure for updating that doesn't mean waiting 10 years for an international labour conference.
Right. Well, on that question of applicability, we've had some pretty interesting news recently. The 75th nation ratified the MLC. That was Myanmar, significantly, and I think that represents
80% now,
80% of global shipping. And that's after it started in 2013 with 30 ratifications, so it must be very gratifying for you. Well, let's get on to the subject at hand. One of the items to be voted on this year is an amendment to the Occupational Health and Safety provision of the Maritime Labour Convention, and I'm going to read it directly here because I think the wording is important. It states that account should also be taken of the latest version of the guidance on eliminating shipboard harassment and bullying, jointly published by the International Chamber of Shipping and the International Transport Workers Federation. So here we have it, the guidance on eliminating shipboard harassment and bullying. Now, I know you both worked on it, but we'll start with Mark and Nautilus, because I believe that's where the story did begin.
So back in beginning of this century, the beginning of the noughties, if that's what we call it these days, we did a survey of our women members, and in short, we got a story back from our members about how they were being treated at sea, suffering discrimination, suffering harassment. And although it was a small group, I'm not saying it was statistically significant, but the message was pretty harrowing, and it compelled us to take action. And that's when we approached Tim at the Chamber of Shipping and said, look, here's the results of our survey of our women members. The results are pretty horrific. I think we need to do something about this problem. And maybe I should pass the baton then to Tim and say, what he's...
Indeed, but I'm interested that you decided early on to engage with the ship owners. Is this because you have what you would call a pretty good working relationship?
We have a very strong relationship in terms of social dialogue nationally, European level and international level. So it's a kind of very natural thing to do, to
Okay.
explore. We disagree on many things, Peter, as I'm sure Tim would confirm, but where we agree, there is significant areas of agreement where we can take effective action on key items, and this is one of them.
All right. Well, we will ask Tim now. What was your reaction when Nautilus came to you with this information?
It was very favourable. We didn't doubt the authenticity of the report and its findings. But what was quite impressive was that Mark came to us and said, we think that this is something we ought to try and find a solution to together in partnership. If they'd come and said, you've got this problem, you need to sort it out, we might have taken a rather different approach. But the fact that they wanted to collaborate, and one of the things Mark said at one of the first meetings that we had was that his union would not stand up for members of the union that harassed and bullied others, and didn't see anything wrong in doing that. And as we explored the subject further, we found that there was, for instance, one company, a big employer of UK seafarers and a big trainer of officer cadets, a good record of taking on females. And their training manager called all the female cadets together one day for a meeting and asked them how they were finding life on board ship. And he was saying that every single one of them had tales of being harassed, bullied, sexually taken advantage of, so to speak. And that sent a very clear message to him that something needed to be done. We also had people working in the passenger ship sectors, where quite often you have as many females working on board in the hotel services as males, and they all felt that this was an issue where if we worked together with the unions, we could do something worthwhile for the sector.
You're listening to ILO live on Facebook here at the Palais des Nations in Geneva. We're in the middle of the International Labour Conference, an important conference with representatives of governments, workers and employers from around the world. Today we're learning the story of an important change to the Maritime Labour Convention. And we'll continue with that story in a moment, gentlemen. But we have some questions coming in from Facebook, and this is something we really want to hear from you. If you've got any questions for our experts, please feel free to enter your questions in the comments section on the Facebook page, and we'll pick them up from there. We have this message from Paul, and I'll throw it to either of you, whichever wants to leap in first. How is the MLC enforced? How do you make sure that seafarers are treated fairly in international waters? It's a good question. It's one thing to have norms, but what happens when the rubber hits the road?
Well, the cornerstone of the MLC is the need for the flag state to certify that the conditions on board the ship are as specified as a minimum in the MLC. So there's a certificate provided to the vessel, and effectively that's a license to trade. Without it, 80% of the world fleet are covered now by the MLC, as you were mentioning earlier. So it is de facto a certificate to trade. Now, to take account of the fact that not all flag states are equal, we also have a system of port state control. So when vessels visit a port, inspectors go on board, official government inspectors go on board, and they will check that the conditions on board are the same as the MLC and have been attested to by the flag state. So, and the seafarers have an opportunity to complain. There's a robust and effective systems of complaint. Everything's documented. So it's early days. It's only 10 years old. It only came into force in 2013. But gradually the seafarers are gaining confidence in the system. And of course, social dialogue, social partnership. The ship owners have a stake in the MLC succeeding. The unions have a stake in the MLC succeeding. And the governments are held to account. There's the ILO supervisory mechanism, which I'm sure your listeners and watchers are very familiar with. This is
significant because labour governance and labour inspection is difficult in some countries. But what you're saying is that because shipping is global, that ships from countries without infrastructure will still be subject to fairly high standards of observance. That's your experience
the
too.
MLC standards, yeah.
Okay, all right. Our next question comes from Debbie. Debbie wants to know how much of an impact can something like at the ILO's level have on bullying and harassment experienced by a seafarer on board a ship? I guess that's right to the heart of a matter. Impact was something we're going to look at later, but let's have an examination of that now. Tim, when this is rolled out and being implemented, and it's had a long tail, it's fair to say, but when it's rolled out, what do you think the impact will be?
Well, what I hope it will be is that flag states will note the fact that it's now part of the MLC. It's in guidance, but there is some imperative behind it. They are required to take due account of guidance, and my hope and indeed my expectation is that they will look to ship owners and seafarers to work together at company level to develop policies appropriate to their operations. It may be very different on a small ship with a small crew from on a cruise ship where you've got over 1,000 crew members, but a local solution or a local means of tackling whatever problem there might exist, with complaint mechanisms, grievance procedures, and this is all covered in the guidance, and the guidance is quite flexible. It gives several examples of how it can all be implemented. So really the route from the ILO, from the MLC down through the flag states and out to the ships is not littered with obstacles. We expect it to be fairly smooth.
Okay, so you have the mechanisms in place and you're hoping to have an impact shortly. A question in from Maria. Thank you, Maria. Maria wants to know, and I'll put this one to you, Mark, if that's okay. Does the MLC differentiate between people who work at sea in the hospitality industry, cruises, for example, and other parts of the shipping industry?
No, they're all seafarers. That's the beauty of the MLC. The MLC defines seafarers as any person working on board a ship in any capacity, and specifically we had this debate within the in the run-up to the adoption of the MLC. There was a significant debate about whether hospitality staff on board cruise ships are seafarers or not, and I'm happy to advise Maria that they are indeed seafarers.
There you go, Maria. We're learning something today that I learned that myself this very moment. Now, let's talk about the impact a little bit more. Tim, I remember we were speaking to you about this issue before, and you were talking about the impact on recruiting staff. Now, I've got a report here. It comes from the International Maritime Organization, the UN body. It says that there's a current shortfall of 16,500 officers currently around the world. By 2025, there'll be a need for an extra 147,500 officers by 2025. I guess this is exactly what you're talking about in a way. If women, potentially half the workforce, are not going to join the shipping industry, you're not going to fill these sorts of gaps, are you?
Well, it's going to be a major challenge, and we need to look as an industry at what contribution initiatives such as this one, where people's dignity at work is going to be protected, and where measures are going to be taken to eliminate harassment and bullying. But those are bound to have an impact. Clearly, they're not going to solve everything by themselves. But with regards to attracting more women to go to sea, if we can promote dignity at work and reassure people that harassment and bullying is something that we are taking serious steps towards eradicating from ships, then it's bound to help. I think that there are other things that can be done. There are a lot of very good role models among female seafarers right now that we can make use of. I think recruitment literature can sometimes continue to portray seafaring as a male occupation. That needs to be addressed. It needs to show that it is inclusive and it's for everybody. Okay. Who has the qualifications and the aptitude, irrespective of whether they're male or female.
Well, as you rightly point out, that's one part of the conversation. This broader conversation of gender equity and balance in this industry is a big conversation. We'll go back to this smaller thread that we're talking about, and that is the guidance on bullying and harassment. So just to get back to that narrative, Mark, you went to Tim, you said, let's work on this together. What were the next steps?
Well, Tim identified pretty quickly that what part of the problem in the UK industry was, for many shipping companies, a lack of resources to, HR departments. That function had been contracted out as part of the massive changes and upheaval that the industry went through in the 80s, and recognising that, because of course we've got experience in dealing with shipping companies representing our members, we recognised that what we needed to do was provide some resources to these companies. So we were looking at educational materials, a video, a workbook to turn that video into a practical guidance and exercise in the workplace, whether that be on the ship or in the company's offices. And equally, we, as Tim has already alluded, we felt that guidance to shipping companies and to seafarers was a more positive way of dealing with this problem, or trying to address this problem, than hitting people over the head and saying we need laws, we need regulations, it's your fault. This is a shared,
but at the same time,
issue.
At the same time, being a guidance, how do you encourage people to take it up, pay attention to it, engage with it? Maybe I'll put that to you, Tim. How did you roll it out?
We got engagement from a large number of companies. We got the ratings union involved in the UK, and I talked to other employers' organisations in the UK outside of the shipping industry to advise them on what we were doing, and seeing what lessons we might be able to learn from other sectors. In fact, that showed that we were actually quite pioneering in what we were doing. Yeah. But the approach that we took was not, it wasn't all stick. You can you can write a line in company terms and conditions of employment saying that harassment and bullying will not be tolerated. But one of the things we had to do was identify exactly what we were talking about with regard to harassment and bullying, and what we found was that it's actually quite rare when somebody sets out to harass and to bully somebody, but their behaviour, or for example their management style, might have a harassing and bullying effect on somebody without them knowing it, and without them really knowing what to do about it.
No, I take your point. Actually, having watched this video, one of the, I think, very intelligent elements to it is the way it teases out behaviour that many of us might think of as just robust behaviour can absolutely take the form of harassment and bullying. Okay, so you've got pretty good take-up in the UK. The next step is to take it to Europe. Tell me about that process.
Well, having successfully concluded the project at UK level, and not wanting to rest on our laurels, and recognising this is a part of a wider problem, it wasn't just a problem in the UK industry, and in fact the labour force on UK ships is multinational. Both of our organisations, Tim, Chambership, and myself, Nautilus, are active and key players. I hopefully be forgiven for promoting that in Europe within the sectoral social dialogue structures that are supported by the European Commission, and we meet regularly. We have a work programme, and this is one of the work items that Tim and I jointly introduced into that process and said, hey, we've done this great work, we believe it's great work in the UK. Is this something that would be of wider interest across the 28 members of the EU?
And were you pushing at an open door? Were they receptive?
Pretty much, yeah. And the Commission was supportive. They provided some funds to, we describe it as Europeanising the guidance and the materials, the training workbook and the video, when we were able to adjust the guidelines to take account of EU legislation rather than UK legislation. We translated the materials into several community languages, and we produced different versions of the video and dubbed it over to a much wider and broader audience, which, if I could just make this point, one of the issues that we identified at UK level, which was times 28 at European level, was that it's no good doing the work and then putting on a shelf to gather dust. If we really wanted to affect a change of behaviour, both on the part of companies and in part of seafarers, we had to make people aware of what we'd done and what we'd produced, and encourage them to use it, not to try and force them, but to encourage them. Say, here's what we've done. You may have done your own stuff, you may have better stuff, but have a look at our guidance, have a look at our materials, and please use them.
And to that end, I think what we'll try and do today is find a link to these resources and put it on our Facebook page. You can pick it up and have a look at it for yourself. Very interesting material it is too. Now, what we're talking about amongst you two, and I guess the broader industry, at least within the Europe context, strikes me as a very rich example of social dialogue. Social dialogue is a term we bandy about here at the International Labour Organization and the International Labour Conference, but it may not have a lot of meaning to everybody out there. So I wonder if you could tell me what social dialogue actually meant for you two in this context. Did you meet regularly? You're on the phone a lot? How did it work?
Well, there's the formal part of social dialogue, which is we have many structures in the UK where we meet to deal with health and safety, war zones, piracy. Collective bargaining tends to be done individually, the union with individual employers, but the big strategic issues tend to be dealt with within those social dialogue structures. At Europe, as I've already mentioned, we have a structure that's formally supported by the EU, and in fact, within the treaty established in the European Union, Article 155, forgive me for being a little bit technical, but that article provides social partners in Europe with the ability to set their own agendas and even formulate legislation. So we come to agreement, as we did to implement the Maritime Labour Convention into European law. Mm-hmm. We adopted an agreement which the Council of Ministers then adopted, and it becomes part of EU law.
Well, that is what happens in the organisations and the institutions. Presumably, Tim, there's an element of just person-to-person persuasion.
I wanted to let him talk about the pub.
Yes, there is, because we find that discussing issues where we have a common interest is more likely to lead to solutions that are suitable for both sides. For instance, you talk about the current and the future shortage of seafarers. Within the UK and within Europe, we're looking at how that can be addressed, and we might disagree on the methods of doing it. But at least we have in common the overall aim. So by engaging in social dialogue, we can decide what we can agree on, what we can't agree on, and then move forward from there. And we find that is, or has proven to be, a very effective means of operating.
You're listening to ILO Live on Facebook. Today we're learning about a proposal to amend the Maritime Labour Convention. That proposal will be voted on at the International Labour Conference here in the Palais in coming days. With me are guests Tim Springett from the UK Shipowners Association and Mark Dickinson from Nautilus, which is a maritime union. Okay, so we've got our model. We've rolled it out across Europe, and the reception seems pretty good. At some point, it seemed that the international stage was beckoning. Why was it necessary to try and get it incorporated into the MLC, Tim?
Well, it seems to be the obvious place to put it, because this is, as you say, the Seafarers' Bill of Rights. It's the instrument that tries to ensure that there is an appropriate floor beneath which labour standards should not be allowed to fall. Yep. And therefore something that we both agree is something that we support and want to encourage should be included. And I'm pleased from the shipowner's point of view that we've maintained the status of it being guidance, so that it encourages social partners to work together and identify the optimum solutions for each ship owner. There was a danger if it went into the mandatory part of the MLC that two things could happen. One, it would force ship owners onto the defensive, because it would put a legally binding obligation on them to do something. And also it would give, as we heard earlier, flag states and port states control something to enforce.
Okay.
And the problem that we might get with that is solutions being devised with other players other than the social partners.
I understand. There was a conversation at the Special Tripartite Committee, which is a body we remember, which is designed to update the MLC, about just how best to implement this guidance. But it seems certain, whichever way it goes, that it is going to have an impact on the way ship owners and seafarers operate at sea. Now, there are a few steps to go before the amendment is adopted. There'll be the vote that I mentioned. Let's think about how this coverage can be... what's the next steps? I guess that's my question. You've got the go-ahead here, you've got the green light. When does it actually start to make a difference to seafarers' lives?
Well, this is just the sort of final piece in the jigsaw. This is the ultimate window on dissemination for the guidance, for the educational material. So, if I could appeal to everybody that's watching on Facebook to, when you put the link up, take a look at the film, look at the guidance, be aware of what constitutes bullying and harassment. Think about your own behaviour. Think about the behaviour of colleagues. Don't stand by while somebody else is being bullied or harassed. If you have a problem yourself, use that guidance, be empowered, use the complaints procedures, don't be afraid to raise these issues. If we get that big conversation going, which, as I said, this is the final and ultimate piece. This is the global place for discussing these issues. It's enshrined now in the MLC. It's a right of all seafarers. It's guidance, Tim's right, but it can't be ignored. It has to be taken on board by member states. Let's get that debate going. Let's eradicate this from ships.
Okay, Tim, so as Mark so eloquently put it there, it's a norm, it's a robust one, but your view on when it'll start to impact on the lives of mariners?
I think it already is having an impact where we have rolled out what we've done so far. I think beyond the UK and beyond Europe, my hope is that nation states and companies and seafarers unions will start taking notice of it even before it formally enters into force as part of the MSC or enters into effect, and pick up on it now, because there are very good reasons for doing so. There are legal reasons. There are laws in many parts of the world that protect people from discrimination and victimisation. Is being harassed, being bullied, not a form of victimisation? So there is a legal framework to back it up. There's also the more positive aspect in terms of promoting seafaring as a career and as a lifestyle. And we've already gone out and said to the world, come to sea, you will be protected by this comprehensive Bill of Rights with a three-pronged means of enforcement, as Mark has said. And it seems obvious to add to that, your dignity at work will be respected. You will be treated with respect, and we do not expect harassment and bullying, whether that be initiation ceremonies, which really should be consigned to the dustbin of history, to inappropriate management styles, are something that hopefully at some point in the reasonably near future we can also put firmly behind us.
Well, that seems a strong point in which to close our conversation. Gentlemen, it's been a long road. Congratulations on your efforts so far. We wish you all the best. If you've just tuned in and missed this interview, the entire conversation will be on our Facebook page. The International Labour Organization is what you're looking for. It'll be there in just a few minutes. Tim Springett with the UK Chamber of Shipping, Mark Dickinson of Nautilus, I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Rita.
And I thank you, our audience, for joining us today.